Welcome, everyone, to this Wednesday session from ODR Cyberweek. Delighted to be here with you and my good friend Danae, who I think is doing absolutely essential work in the ODR field, thinking about how can we ensure that our ODR implementations are successful for the long run. So Danae and I have been having conversations about this. She did a presentation for ICODR a little while ago, and I invited her to come back for Cyberweek because I think this conversation is so important. And I'm hopeful that we can turn a lot of her great thinking and systematic breakdown of this process into a new ICODR standard. So Danae, thank you for taking the time. I so appreciate it. And why don't I let you kick off and give us some orientation on some of the great thinking that you've done around this.
Absolutely. And thank you so much, Colin. I really appreciate the invitation. It's been amazing to just get everybody's minds together, see what's been going on, and everything from the ICODR presentation that we did a couple of weeks ago to obviously Cyber Week today, back to the ODR forum in Montreal a few weeks ago. There's definitely a lot of stuff, a lot of exciting stuff happening, and hopefully we can be part of that. So thank you for inviting me. So a little bit about me, I guess. First thing I always like to check, is everyone able to see my screen? Are you able to hear me okay?
Perfect.
All right.
Crystal
Awesome.
clear.
Perfect. So as Colin said, we're going to sort of focus this a bit on a bit of the discussion. I know I myself, I'm a little neurospicy. So if you have any questions, I know if I have them, if I wait too long, if I wait for the parking lot at the end, I'll forget the context around why I asked that question. So if you are like me, please feel free to interrupt, put up a hand, feel free to jump in. The focus of this is really to sort of socialize some of the aspects that Colin and I have discovered, certainly in relation to some of the studies that have come out surrounding ODR recently. And also to get your feedback. So sort of socialize what our consensus is and sanity check ourselves. So a little bit about me. I've been a mediator for more than 25 years now. Started actually before there were even community mediation programs that were training, especially youth. So, and I think I even predate the federal mediation and conciliation services. So when I was first trained, this was back when mediation itself, even the face-to-face process, everything ADR was still a grand experiment. So it's been really exciting to see how that has changed from back then up into today, where we're now involving technology and AI, and we're really on the bleeding edge. A little bit about my experience. I started with community mediation, started with a local community organization, moved into some of the program roles, program manager roles, worked with referral sources, court programs, all sorts of, basically, if you could send it to mediation, I've worked with it. Also worked at the Better Business Bureau for a few years, where I focused on obviously some more e-commerce disputes, sort of reestablishing or maintaining relationships between consumers, merchants, business to business. And then a couple of years ago, closer to 10 years than I'd like to admit, based on my age, not based on what we're doing, certainly, but Colin and his team with Modria, invited me to come on and help them. So as part of that, part of my sort of the deducing of the experiences that I've had, I've recently set out to also start consulting. So sort of, and I'll get into this a little bit later, but helping ADR organizations really implement ODR and how to do it correctly. And of course, that's based on a little bit of my education. Thankfully, I live in an area where Wayne State University, one of the few universities, at least when I was going to school, that has an actual peace and conflict studies program. So thankful that they were in my backyard, graduated with my degree from there. So I am going to go through at least the content portion fairly quickly. As I've said, we really want to focus on the discussion portion of this. But sort of high level, we're going to talk about sort of the history of the ethical principles, and translate sort of that theory to practice. We're going to talk about the context of ODR best practices, a little bit about how there's a difference between sort of the holistic, and I use that with the W in the front, the holistic approach to an entire ADR program, one aspect of which is ODR program, one aspect of which is the ODR system design itself. Once we get past that, we're going to talk about our tales from the edge of the map, and we'll sort of open it up to a discussion, get your feedback. Certainly speak to, if you have any experiences that you've had that you'd like to share with us, any frustrations. That's what we're here for. We're really here to take that feedback, all of the things that we've learned to date about ODR, and learn from them and walk the walk instead of to just talking the talk, and make sure that we're continuously improving the industry and the market on the whole. And then, of course, we'll also have some question and answer at the end. So looking at translating theory to practice, the history of ODR best practices, they're very high level. They are guided by principles basically of ADR. So they sort of morphed as alternative dispute resolution, embrace this technology, this internet technology, and they really focus on the ethical principles for ODR system design. What we're talking about doing is their goal is really to enhance the quality, the effectiveness, the scope of all ODR programs. They focus on ethical principles, and they're very broad. And that makes sense because we know that we know ADR can be implemented in so many different ways and so many different dispute types. Same is true for ODR. So when we're looking at a really high level, we want to make sure that we have sort of like an organization would have their guiding values or principles. So brief history, I believe the first swing at best practices was with the National Center for Technology and Dispute Resolution. And there was also a similar sort of structure offered by the National Center for State Courts. They focused on 17 high points, everything from accessibility to legal obligation, to fairness, honesty, impartiality. So we see some of that that cultural transition from ADR principles, that voluntary, that confidential, that neutral, and moving into a technology space with some considerations for what may be a little bit different contextually. The next sort of, round of best practices was certainly ICODR, International Council for Online Dispute Resolution, Resolution Systems Institute. When I look at this, they have basically 8 high-level sort of guiding values or principles. And I think when I look at this, I sort of see this as the initial 17 sort of boiled down, using some broader terms to embrace all 17 of those, but really sort of truncate them down to 8 major rules. When I think of the existing ODR best practices, I think of it as sort of like the Hippocratic Oath, right? First, do no harm. We all do this. We don't do this for our health, right? Like we do this because we want to help people. We do this because we want to have an impact. Whether we've been personally had issues or had personal conflict in our lives, whether we've seen family members go through it, we understand that conflict is an aspect of human life. We get involved in these processes because we want to help, but we don't want to make them worse. So really keeping that sort of that high level theory, sort of that motto, that slogan, and then our guiding values. So looking at the context when we talk about best practices, defining our context, a lot of times we see or ADR organizations that want to implement ODR, the first instinct is to find an ODR vendor, partner with that ODR vendor, and get into designing the ODR system, which is certainly a very important aspect of this. But I tend to think of that almost as like going to the car dealership without having done any research and trusting that salesperson to tell you what features and functionality you need. Not speaking nothing against ODR vendors, you guys are great, but you have a sort of subset of concerns and considerations, whereas the ODR organization maybe has a sort of a different perspective. So what we're going to talk about as far as best practices today is really bridging that gap between the organizations, the ODR vendors, all of the stuff that sort of goes in between and outside of the specific ODR system. And the reason that I really like this graphic is there's 2 ways to get there, right? We've got one, sometimes we might go across the bridge. The other option, sometimes we might go across the water, we might swim across, we might take some boats. So there's all sorts of different approaches, but we want to make sure that we have basically both sides, the ADR organizations and the vendors, setting up the system for success. So when we talk about defining the context, so what I've done is I have basically taken what we use in the sort of the IT or software development world, we have a life cycle that we follow. And what I've done is I've basically layered that onto how to implement an ODR program, not just an ODR system. So on the left, we've got our program design stuff. On the right, we've got our system design. And in the middle, you can see that there are some things that sort of overlap. But if we start at the bottom left, when we look at research, our first step is always basically going to be to analyze our program goals. From there, we're going to plan our ODR program. We're going to define our program policies, any definitions. Then we're going to document it, and we'll talk about that as I go through these next couple steps. And then that's when we'll also start working sort of the bridge there into the design step is blueprinting the ODR system. Again, a very important aspect, but still one aspect of creating the ODR system. Then we'll talk a little bit about working with the system designers, your design team, how you're going to build your ODR site. And most of the time, your vendors are going to walk you through this process. But just to make sure that we've got that continuity there, testing the ODR system, launching the ODR system, getting it out to the public, giving them access to it. And then, of course, evaluating the program. As time goes on, what have we learned? What can we do better? What should we maybe stop doing? And then bringing that back into the research and basically continuing on with the sustainability model of our program. So looking at mapping any questions about the context, best practices, the history, anything that you guys want to correct me on, anything that I maybe haven't considered?
No, this is great. It's so comprehensive. I'm taking lots of notes so that we can put this into our draft document that we processed together. Did you come up with this infinity loop? Did you mention is this a common system design framework, or it's
yes.
really, I love it. It's comprehensive.
Yeah, so it's actually the sort of like the IT roadmap system design.
Okay.
My husband is actually, he works in IT as an enterprise infrastructure architect.
Great.
So I will cite my source on some of this. He designed the slide and I retrofitted.
I love it. I love it. It's great. Yep.
It sort of speaks to, we can learn more regardless of the resource, right? Regardless of whether it's a direct context or in our industry.
I completely agree with you. Yeah. So this is great. I almost want to get a T-shirt with this on it. So I love it. Yeah.
Oh, I'm sure there's definitely going to be a play on words there. We can meme it.
We can meme it. That's good.
Okay, so talking about mapping your ODR journey, I consider the implementation of an ODR program similar to planning a vacation. Each step requires a little bit of research, and that research is cumulative. It requires some documentation. So we're going to start with basically choosing to embark on an ODR journey. At the end of our journey, we should end up with an ODR plan, similar to what those of us who have been in the industry for a while, similar to what we would see with like an ADR plan, right? But specifically contextualized for online dispute resolution. And that ODR plan can be used to help with program governance, vendor selection, neutral selection, continuous improvement, all that fun stuff. So our first question, our first step is choosing adventure. So there's some key questions that we're going to cover that we want to think about when we start doing this. The first is, do we want to implement ODR? Why do we want to implement ODR? Are we implementing ODR because in response to COVID? Is there maybe some grant funding out there that'll help our program and we want to get on board with that? Is it to comply with the law? Is it maybe to help agency resources? We also want to talk about at this point or start thinking about how can we commit to an ODR program? What do we need to define? So when we talk about committing to an ADR program, are we going to walk the talk? Are we going to update our contracts so that if we have an issue with one of our vendors, with our referral sources, with one of our mediators, where ODR is our defaulted sort of venue of choice or our first intervention process. So basically, how are we going to model using ODR in resolving our disputes as an organization? Also, ODR definitions. There's a big misconception that implementing ODR is simply taking an existing ADR face-to-face process and moving it online. That's actually probably that. Colin, you can back me up on this. It's a lot more complex than that.
It is.
there are things that we need to consider. First one that came to my mind is the definition of confidentiality. How does that definition of confidentiality change in an online forum? Are there things that we need to define as far as the outcome documents, right? Do we live in an area where an agreement that's reached electronically or online, is that enforceable? So sort of looking at those ODR definitions, looking at our existing plans and our existing programs, and also learning from them, our existing ADR definitions, and contextualizing them for ODR. So at the results of this, you should end up with basically a vision statement. This is something that should be prepared by somebody on a very high level. At this point, we're really looking at not even the 20,000 foot view. We're up at 50,000 feet. We're just looking at our vision statement, our policy statement, and anything that we need to sort of account for as part of that transition. Next step in our ODR journey is our destinations. So where do we want to go? We know we need to go on a vacation, right? We've decided that we want to go on vacation. We understand what our goals are. Maybe we want to get up to the mountains and get some fresh air. Maybe we want to go to Miami and go party. Maybe we want to go to Europe and get some culture. What are the goals for our program? So what are the goals for our ODR plan? What is our program scope? What are our what I usually recommend at this point in the process, taking a look at, if you have an existing program, what is that existing program? What are your existing definitions? What is your current process? What are what can we aim to change? Are there any pain points? Is there some resistance to ADR that can maybe be alleviated through ODR? And also considering how we're going to measure success. So looking at our scope, basically setting a limitation on the scope of the ODR program. That could be limited by dispute type. It could be limited by geographical region or dollar amount. Could be affected by the status of the case. We certainly know the earlier that we intervene in the process, the more successful our ADR processes are. So when are we going to consider that? What are our program goals? What are our performance measures, our KPIs? Making sure that they are those SMART goals, that they're smart, they're measurable, they're achievable, they're relevant, and that they're time bound. Also, our evaluation criteria, our overall program evaluation. How do we expect to measure the success, and what are we going to do when we discover that we need to change something? Next step is transportation. So moving along in our transportation journey, key questions here. I mean, how is ODR going to fit into our existing process? Are we going to do something that's purely online? Are we going to allow parties to come in and create the disputes themselves? Are we maybe implementing as part of a court program where we'll have a case management system that's going to refer cases to us? When will a dispute be referred? Are we going to refer a dispute for a court program maybe after the defendant's been served? Are we going to, again, allow the parties to come in directly? Are we going to have folks, maybe if we're doing like a parenting time domestic type dispute, if we're going to do are we going to, for domestic type disputes, are we maybe going to focus on dispute types where maybe the parties can still advocate for themselves, but they can't be in the room together? They get angry and nothing constructive happens when they're together, but through using this asynchronous communication, they can achieve those goals. Another key question here is looking at our ADR process type. Again, there's sort of the idea, or what we've seen as we do these implementations, is if we have an ADR organization that is wants to implement ODR, maybe they want to implement it for just mediation, but is it possibly beneficial to allow take the parties through a self-guided diagnosis or self-guided conciliation process before they move into mediation? Maybe we want to layer arbitration as an online option after face-to-face mediation. So looking at our ADR process types and seeing if there's maybe something new or creative we can do to layer on to our existing ADR product or process offering. Also looking at the ODR process type. There's two major schools of thought when it comes to ODR process. One is, are we looking at that asynchronous communication? So that's something that we would see similar to like eBay, the Amazon model, where you basically click and say you've got an issue with something. They say, what's the issue? How would you like it resolved? Would you like a refund? Would you like a replacement, an exchange? And how would you, how would you like to receive your refund? Those type questions. Or are you picturing more of like a face-to-face, so something like a Zoom or a virtual court? That's going to be very important, especially when helping you to decide, especially when helping through the vendor selection process. Also, our case selection criteria. Looking at what cases we want to select. Do we want to maybe start with non-complex divorces, minimal assets, no children, and then as we grow over time, as we work out the sort of some of the kinks, we can get into more complex disputes. Your ODR plan is going to vary greatly depending on the complexity of the dispute. Your workflows are going to change drastically. A simple monetary dispute or small claims dispute is obviously is typically going to be less complex than like a divorce or a parenting time. Also looking at our ODR timing. When are we going to refer disputes? Are the parties going to create the disputes themselves? Are they going to be referred from a court program? But when are we going to basically refer cases into our ODR program? And then suitability screens. We typically think of suitability screens for like domestic cases, right? Domestic violence screenings. But this is one area where recent studies have really shown us that we can do some good. We can improve here. So a lot of the feedback we've gotten from recent studies are, do the parties, do they speak the language that the system is offered in? Do they have reliable internet access? Do they need some accommodations? So asking ourselves, should we be asking these questions before we start the ODR process? And then, of course, looking at our process evaluation criteria. How are we going to evaluate our processes? How are we going to make sure that that these portions are meeting our goals? And how frequently are we going to do that? Next up is looking at our travel partners. This is another area where recent studies have highlighted that we could do a lot more. One of the things that I really like to focus on, at least, especially when we're talking about best practices, is the difference between the ODR program roles and the ODR system roles. So our program team versus our system team. At this point, we're really asking, who's going to come with us? Who are the parties going to be? And the answer to that should be everyone at any level that is either going to be interested or affected by a new ODR program. We want to make sure that our interested and affected parties they have a stake in the program and the system. So that could be something like looking at having party representatives, attorney representatives, neutral representatives as part of defining not just your program, but also your system. I look at these folks as being part of the whole program design, not just the system design. And one thing that you can do with the dispute group, the system design group, is to involve them into an advisory group after going live. They can assist in implementation. They can assist in evaluation. So even though there may be some redundancy across the program roles and the system roles, people can still be used even after we've implemented the system and done that work. But looking at our program goals, identifying a champion, who's going to be the person that is the driving force, who's going to be our missionary, our evangelist, who's going to be the program manager, our program decision makers. Looking at our referral sources, where are we going to get disputes from? Should we be reaching out to organizations if we're looking at landlord-tenant disputes? Should we be looking at organizations that maybe provide some rent relief? Can they send us some cases? Looking at our neutrals. How are we going to select those neutrals? How are we going to involve our parties? Also looking at our evaluation teams. And then, of course, our system roles, our project managers, our policy decision makers, technical representatives, neutrals. Your ODR system vendor will probably work with you on defining those specific roles per their implementation style. But we're going to want to make sure that we do the pre-work and identifying who those folks could potentially be. Also looking at pre-training or training needs. Is pre-training needed? This is an often overlooked part of travel partners. We understand that there's probably going to be some resistance. We've seen in the past, those of you that have been around since sort of the beginning of the mediation experiment, a lot of the feedback that we frequently got from judges, for example, was, well, if this mediation program is going to come in and do such a great job and handle all my cases for me, what am I going to do if I don't have a docket? So that job security, that job security concern, is there anything that we can do pre-training wise to make sure that we have that buy-in? Do we need to pre-train our staff? And we'll get into that a little more in detail when we start talking in some subsequent steps here. But also, so step 5, travel deals, our budget. We often look at ODR as the only costs being the system itself. We look at things like the vendor costs for implementation, licensing, but where we should really start with this is if we have a current program, looking at our current costs, and not just what those costs are, but the cost type. So that could be things like training materials, design team staffing, mediator expenses, neutral expenses if you pay your neutrals, software licensing, I'm trying to think of some other costs, operational costs. And then we also want to document what those costs are. So we're not just looking at what the actual dollar amount is. We want to take a look at where the money is going first, and then actually look at the associated amounts. And then also look at our available funding sources. How are we going to fund this project? Again, is it grant funded? Is it something that came out as a result of COVID? Are we going to make an internal investment? Are we going to look at donors? Do we have a donor pool, an existing donor pool? And then also looking at the timing. We certainly want to account for like our fiscal responsibilities, our fiscal calendar, or if we're looking at grant funding, how far out or is it that we're going to receive that grant funding? Do we need a timeline? Do we need to account for a timeline there? If we're applying for grants, do we need to hire a grant writer? So that's all going to have some implications on our budget. So at the end of our ODR plan documentation, we want to make sure that we at least have an idea of what the budget's going to be. Even if you don't necessarily know what the costs are going to be, looking at those cost types will help you. It'll better prepare you for asking those questions, certainly during the vendor selection process, as well as any other reporting responsibilities that you may need. Also looking at the budget evaluation criteria. How frequently are we going to review this? How are we going to determine what is a good investment? Even if we're impacting folks and we're doing really great with the program, maybe it's not economically feasible. How are we going to address those concerns when that question comes up? So really we're looking at when will we have the budget? When will we, sorry, there we go. All right, so step 6 are travel dates. All right, so looking at our ODR plan documentation. Now we're moving into our timeline. So I talked a little bit ago about our budget allocation. We want to make sure that we have the money, that we're accounting for it, that we know when it's going to come in, that we're accounting for our pre-training schedule. One thing that I do want to mention at this point is that what I'm referring to here is our ODR plan schedule, our ODR plan timing. When you work with an ODR vendor, once you've selected one, they will do an evaluation of their internal availability, their project schedule based on their resource availability, based on any development, all that stuff. So what we're really talking about right now is our internal dates. Basically, when are we going to be ready to start doing this? And also looking at when are we going to be able to engage? Also looking at our life cycle evaluation. How often are we going to evaluate this? Are we doing this as a pilot program? How long do we need to get a good data sample so that we actually have enough disputes or enough data to make an evaluation? So sort of looking at the calendar aspect of things. Step 7. All right. Looking at our accommodations. So some key questions here. Things like, what are our hosting requirements? Do we live somewhere where, for those of us in the IT world, GDPR? Do we have basically data privacy, recovery? Do we have hosting requirements? Do we live in an area where our ODR site needs to be hosted locally? Does it need to be hosted in the same country? Also looking at our functional requirements, things that we talked about earlier, like our asynchronous ODR model versus like our virtual courts or Zoom model, having an idea of what we want that to look like. Also, maybe putting together some workflows, a vision of basically what that case life cycle is going to be. Looking at reporting requirements. Certainly, if you're looking at grant funding, your grant funding may be dependent on certain metrics. Your ODR vendor is going to need to know what those are so that we're tracking those from the beginning. I'm sure, Colin, you've run into this before where we've been doing something for a year and we go to pull a report and we haven't been tracking that this whole time.
Absolutely. I want to talk about that.
Yeah, so you got to make sure that you're tracking this stuff. Also looking at like your current reports, if you have a current ADR program, let's see what would be nice. So, what are areas where we have to do a lot of like human lifting to make that data make sense? Looking at our user access, who's going to interact with the system? How are they going to interact with the system? What documents do we want generated from the system? Do we want a non-agreement document? Do we need a statement of understanding or a memorandum of understanding? Do we need to gather party electronic signatures? What do we want those to look like aesthetically when we, at the result of our ODR program? Now, this may not be something that you have ready when you go through your vendor selection process, but you definitely want to make sure that you have that, that you at least are accounting for it and understand the information that you need to be gathering. And then, of course, looking at our system evaluation criteria. If there's an issue, what is the remediation process with the vendor? How will we evaluate our ODR system? How do we evaluate that our system is working? What do we do if we find out that there's an area or something that we want to change? What does that process look like? Going back to our budget aspect, what is the cost associated? And then getting into our accommodations, step 8, our tours. So once we get there, what are we going to do when we're there? One of the things that when I look at sort of the personality type of those of us who work in the ADR, ODR world, we're comfortable being the third party, right? We're comfortable sort of being the fly on the wall, sort of gently nudging the conversation, really listening, reframing. What we don't do well, we don't brag about ourselves. We have these amazing processes that work for so many people. I know I became a mediator because when I was trained at 14 years old, I went home and was able to have a constructive conversation with my mother at 14 years old. I became a mediation evangelist after that. So we need to get better at doing that. We need to make sure that the people are aware these programs are out there. Recent studies have shown us that this is a huge area for improvement. We have these amazing programs, these amazing processes, but people don't know that they're out there. They don't know that they can come to us directly and file a dispute online. They don't know that their case has been referred to ODR. We want to make sure. So how are we making users aware? Are we going to do anything in the way of participation incentives? What is a reward? How are we presenting ourselves as a viable alternative to the existing processes? Also, are we going to gather some success stories? Do we maybe want to do some surveys at the end of an ODR process, get some party feedback? Are we going to use to promote those, to get some buy-in, to sort of keep that buzz going? Also being open to constructive criticism. When we identify our pain points, how are we going to identify them? How are we going to improve them based on that feedback? We want to make sure that when we get that information that we are approaching it as constructive criticism. Certainly in the spectrum of the history of human conflict, ODR is very new. We know that there are things that we can do to be better. But we want to also make sure that we are sharing that we're open to receiving that feedback and that we value that feedback. All right. looking at up next, packing our suitcase. So as we've gone through all these steps, we're probably going to get to the end of this and have some documentation, right? But some key questions to make sure that we have everything included. What existing program plans do we have? That's great for ODR vendors to have. They get an understanding of what your existing process is. They may be able to better advise you on how to translate your existing face-to-face process to ODR. What training materials are needed, not just what are needed, but do we need to design them? Do we need to develop those? Or are we going to hire somebody to come in and present that? Do we need to develop press releases, marketing materials, party awareness materials, rack cards, all the things that we talked about evaluating? Now we need to design those evaluation forms. So this is really where we start getting into the tangible aspect of sort of the think tank exercises that we've gone through so far. And I know I'm running a little bit over. Apologies, Colin.
No worries, no worries. Take your time. We're going to be going back through some of this too. So, you don't need to provide all the color because I want to come back and get clarity on some of what you're talking about here. But I've been taking lots of notes and I've been putting into the document. So yeah, walk us through the rest.
All right. Well, the good news is this is the last step. After that, I promise we're going to open it up. You guys can be part of the conversation.
Great.
But step 10, I think, is probably the most forgotten step. This is at the top of this. I know I kind of promised that if you go through these steps, you'll have this great ODR program. Everything's going to be fine. You're going to be able to navigate the seas of ODR implementation. Your vacation's going to go off without a hitch. But as many times as I've done this, as many times as we've done this, there's always something new to learn. There's always something that we haven't considered. There's always something that we learn that we can do better. So basically sort of putting on our thinking cap and thinking about how are we going to manage that, right? Even things like change management inside our organization. Maybe the reason that we have an employee that is reluctant is because they're scared for their job. There's maybe some job security. There may be some skills training that we need to offer them. So should we be looking at that as sort of one of our travel insurance policies? Also, who's going to have oversight over the change management? Is that something that should go to your ODR program champion, or is there maybe a more nuanced way to establish that buy-in? Mm-hmm. Also, how are our resource limitations? What happens if our ODR program champion gets sick? What if they win the lottery? What if they, real life happens, right? What if they want to go on vacation? Also looking at staff burnout. Staff burnout can become a thing. We know that. So what are our contingency plans if that happens? Who are the staff backups? What happens if the timeline shifts? What happens if we burn through our whole budget in the first 6 months? What does that remediation process look like? Also looking at our evaluation concerns. What are we going to do if something comes back that we want to address? Are we going to provide coaching for our mediators? Are we going to provide additional coaching or training to the parties? So really looking at how those concerns will be addressed when and if they do come to our attention. And I also do want to say there's another option out there as well that Colin and I that I've been working on. Like I said, I was set out recently to help with some of this stuff as an agency resource. So the other option is always hire a travel agent. But Colin, this is where we're going to open it up to sort of our tails from the edge of the map.
Yeah, I think everybody can see why I think Danae is the leading mind on thinking through this. I don't think anyone has the experience that you have in actually being where the rubber hits the road, and you're the most experienced travel agent. I love the analogy of the trip that you use for the presentation, but I'm already thinking, Danae, about the ways that I want to bring you in on some of my really complex ODR system deployments, because you've really thought through this here. But I love this, and this is great. Walk us through these key considerations and lessons learned.
Yeah, so sort of just conversation prompts.
Yeah, because I've actually come up with some of my own too in the document, but these are evolved. So I think this is almost like lessons learned, like best practices from people who've been on the front lines. These are the kinds of things you got to think. But tell me what you mean by the panacea fallacy. That it's just going to solve everything.
Exactly, exactly. Especially for those of us who have been in like implementation roles or from the ODR vendor side, what we hear from a lot of our customers is that ODR is sort of this panacea solution, right? That we can refer especially in the courts context, every small claims dispute that comes into our court, we can refer that to ODR, and the parties are going to resolve the dispute.
Right.
Don't get me wrong, I love ODR, 100% here for it. But it's just another tool in the toolkit.
Right.
What this does is it allows the parties who are able to resolve disputes using this way, because using ADR processes in an online forum, and helping them with that self-determination. And that also sort of frees up our resources for the more complex disputes with the parties that maybe can't resolve issues either through conciliation, mediation, arbitration. But a lot of times we get that feedback that ODR is going to be this miracle solution that's going to solve all the problems. And I think we need to really be clear and level set that ODR is great. It is wonderful when it works. Right. If we have parties or disputes that are not suited for this forum, again, we take the forum to the fuss, right? If we're not taking the right forum to the fuss, it's not going to work. So that's some of the things that we need to consider when we look at our case selection criteria, our pre-screening process.
Yeah. Jeff posted, how many ODR implementations that use mediators are taking place in web-based settings? In other words, not court-referred settings. That's a big question, Jeff. There are lots of, I know at ODR.com, we're working on lots that are not in the court-referred settings. We're doing stuff for the California Association of Realtors. We're doing stuff for bar associations. We're doing stuff for nonprofits. They're doing homelessness prevention. I don't know, Danae, do you have a thought about that?
I did. I have a lot of thoughts on this. One of the things that came up when we were discussing this with the ICODR group was we've very closely aligned online dispute resolution with courts, especially here in the US. And I know some of our ODR vendors have also sort of aligned their products with like their courts and justice or their enterprise justice, like case management systems. I personally am of the mindset that ODR we should look at ODR as more than just the court programs, right? Courts are by definition reactive. There is already a dispute. The parties have already gone through probably some processes and tried to resolve it themselves. So getting us aligned with proactive organizations, even community mediation centers, again, bringing the forum to the fuss, going to collection agencies. And we've actually seen recently sort of a bit of a paradigm shift from the courts. Even if we implement at 100% of the courts in our given area, there's still going to be conflict. And what we've seen recently is consumer protection agencies are starting to embrace this a lot more. So courts are definitely important. We definitely need to consider them, but they're sort of one aspect of all the things that we can do.
They're one audience, they're one channel for deploying these ODR systems. Okay, Nick, I see your hands up. Ask a question, and then I've got a couple things I want to talk about before we make everybody go to work. But what were you going to say, Nick?
Hi, thanks for this. My question is, ODRs often expecting experienced mediators to practice differently. And for one example, a lot of ODR systems talk about text mediation or text-based.
Right.
I've yet to hear anyone say, oh, this is a training we used and it's based on this research or this experience. I've talked to people who said, yeah, we threw together a training for our court roster or whatever it may be. Is anyone aware of a training grounded in anything beyond what we think may work?
That's a great question, Nick. And I'm actually going to use that as an excuse to segue to me controlling the screen. So Danae, are you okay if I grab it back from you?
Absolutely.
Okay, so I'm going to stop your sharing and let me share. So the real reason why, my not so secret agenda for inviting Danae is I think this is so important that I think we at ICODR need to think about a new set of best practice recommendations around ODR implementations. And I think what Danae just presented is the bones of that. Now, Nick, you just talked about training. ICODR does have a document here that sort of has training components for ODR trainings. And these are the pieces that we think if you're a face-to-face mediator and you want to transition to online practice, these are the kind of things that you need to cover in that training. Now, we've done at Media University, we've done a couple ODR trainings for experienced face-to-face mediators. And there was a big working group, actually, that Mediate did. That was a 6-month working group talking about how do we evolve mediation training to account for the fact that so much mediation is taking place online. So I think this is a key systems design question too, is as we transition from ADR to ODR, what support and training do we need to provide to neutrals to make sure they make the jump with us? Because obviously the value of the system is only as good as the quality of what it delivers. And the neutrals are an essential component in that. So if you don't have a plan to take their hand and help them through the transition, I think they're not only a key stakeholder, they're also a key partner moving along. And when Danae talks about burnout and things like that, you have to make sure that you're thinking about the experience from the perspective of neutrals. So Nick, I think this is a really important issue, and it's something we have to do better at. One of the things that frustrates me, and Danae, I'm sure you've seen this too, it's not Modria and it's not ODR.com. I'm not going to name who I think has done this, but I think there's some places that some firms that have made big promises, and then when they come in, the execution is lacking. Oftentimes, there's not enough training, there's not enough realistic goal setting, and there's not enough, how would I say, evolution in terms of the project. And I think then people say, well, look, we did ODR and it failed, right? Like we rolled it out, nobody used it. There wasn't any marketing, it's like, let's pull the plug. And that's a shame to me, because I think we now have the point where lots of organizations, courts and organizations want to deploy ODR, but if they get substandard systems design and deployment, then they're going to say, well, we tried it and it didn't work. Maybe they got some cut rate service from somebody that said they could do it for a couple $100 a month. Maybe they didn't really get very sophisticated technology, or maybe they weren't fully committed to rolling it out. But no matter what those reasons are, I think those bad deployments undermine the ODR message. And that's why it's important for ICODR to publicize some standards to ensure that we up the quality of the deployments that we're doing. What do you think about that, Danae?
I was actually going to say, I want to actually go back to, and when we talked about our promotion, right? Colin, I will go ahead and promote your training for mediators. The training that's basically what I've used over the last years in training our mediators. So basically using things like, how does the concept of active listening change when we move it to an asynchronous online forum, when we don't have those communication cues of body language, of tone. So Colin, you've done a great job on training that and providing those resources. But I think sometimes what we've also seen is using sort of like a train the trainer model. When it's provided by an ODR vendor, they may focus more on how to navigate the system, right? Like system navigation, stuff that's specific to them, not necessarily specific to the skill sets of the mediators.
You're exactly right about that.
Yeah, you lose some of that continuity of the ADR principle through the ODR system, and then the ODR principles.
Right.
But that's great feedback. That's definitely something that I want to add to the training aspect of this when we talk about specifically our stakeholders and our sort of pre-planning processes.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think I may resemble that remark. I've created an ODR.com handbook, and we did a training on this, and it goes very deep into the ODR.com platform. So it talks about how do you create cases, how do you manage calendars, how do you do activities. It's got screenshots, it walks through everything, but that's not teaching somebody how to be an online mediator, right? So I think sometimes we confuse the training on the platform with the training on the skill set. So I think you're naming a really important thing, Nick, and it's something that we should call out. There's one other thing I want to share before we dive into the Google Doc, and I know we're running out of time here. But I don't know how many of you know about my good friend, Jan Martinez, she ran the dispute resolution program at Stanford Law School for a long time, but she spent 10 years writing this book on dispute systems design, preventing, managing, and resolving conflict with Stephanie and Lisa. And Danae, when I see your presentation, it takes me, because I co-teach with Jan, and I teach ODR and she teaches DSD, and your framework synthesizes this so elegantly and with so much hands-on experience But one of the things that they created in this book is this analytic framework for how you do dispute systems design. Now, dispute systems design is different than deployment, but I think it's interesting to see how much this mirrors a lot of the structure that you have in your presentation, Danae, because we talk about goals. What do the systems decision makers seek to accomplish, and what types of conflicts is going to address? Who are the stakeholders? What's the relative power? What's the context and culture that you're deploying this dispute system design within? What's the process and structure? What processes are used to manage, and what are the incentives and disincentives? And then resources, that gets to sustainability. And then the final one is success and accountability. How transparent is it? Is it successful? How do we evaluate it in an ongoing way? So, and I think this whole question of power and control is very important. Who is designing the system? Are they optimizing it for themselves, or are they optimizing it for others? So what I'd like to do, and let me share my screen one more time. If you look in the chat, I provided a link to a Google Doc, and I think this is it here. So what I've been doing, Danae, as you're presenting, is I've been trying to restructure and pull some of these things that you're presenting into a doc. It's not structured along the travel, and this is way too much detail, because you've gone into I mean, what you'll see in these ICODR standards is they're often one page, or maybe 2 pages, and we often tie them directly back to the ICODR values. So that's another exercise, is whether or not we want to bucket some of these steps into the different ICODR standards. But then we can have a best practices section that says, look, based on our experience rolling things out, these are the things that you need to think about. That's kind of like what we talked about for the training. It's like, these are the components of a training. Based on our expertise, these are the things you need to think about. So maybe this best practice would look more like this. But this Google Doc here, and again, this is all based on your work, Danae, so I'm not going to do anything without your 100% buy-in. But the reason why this is an open, collaborative Google Doc is I want everybody to come in and put in comments and thoughts and questions and revisions. Like these takeaways, these key considerations that you've come up with, Danae, I added in the ones that you had on that final slide, because there are some other ones I really like don't build the parachute after you jumped, or who's responsible? Is the vendor responsible for this? The organization responsible for this? Because if we don't know who's responsible, it's not going to get done. So these things are great, and I think kind of surfacing, but I'm not sure that's necessarily going to be in a best practice doc. I mean, this may be a training that we ask you to put together, Danae, because you have lived experience. I'm sure you have scars up and down your arms from times when some of this advice was not followed. But what I tried to do was all the things you talked about, I put into 11 steps. And there may be a way to consolidate these a little bit. But you'll see, like, set the goals, document the current state, define the scope of your project, identify the key stakeholders, think through timing, create a plan of action, create the required documents, figure out your marketing promotion strategy, track your performance, plan for long-term sustainability, and also prepare for the unexpected. And that's, I thank you. Please give your husband an extra hug tonight, because I can see some of his influence in some of this. Because I think oftentimes what I see is people plan for the happy case, but they don't plan for the unhappy case, where their champion retires, as you say, or they win the lottery, or your funding dries up. But then for each of these steps, you've got great questions to ask. Like the first step is set the goals and vision. Why do we want this? What do we want? Can we commit to it? What do we need to get the support for it? What's the scope? What's the goals? And then the current state. What do we currently have? And this is an important one. You mentioned this. We have to have our baseline metrics. Before we build anything, we have to set what are the KPIs that we're tracking, so that we know what the impact is of when we make a change. Because we don't get the baseline metrics and we deploy it, well, then you don't know, did we move the dial in the way that we wanted to move the dial? But then this, again, is a distillation of your points. Set the scope of the project, set the goals, set the evaluation. What dispute types will be referred? What different ADR and ODR processes? And then the key players. And I think this is great. I mean, this is a great thought list. I mean, I think in a court, it's a different set of players. Like you have to deal with the court administrative officers. That's different than if you're dealing with a startup where, they don't have an administrative officer. You may be dealing with the product managers. But I think that's great. And then the timing section. What is the window of opportunity? Does there need to be a pre-training? When will we have the budget? When are the key people we need in order to ensure this thing succeeds? When are they available? Because sometimes you can do it too early and the stakeholders are unavailable, and then you've got a disconnect there. And then this whole idea of creating a plan, and then this list of documents to be created. I mean, this is very, very thorough in terms of everything. I mean, some people may say, I can't create all those documents. I'm not going to kick this off. But, if you have a subset of those, I think that could be powerful and helpful. And then sustainability, this is actually something that I really feel a lot of deployments don't think about in a systematic way. How do we ensure this thing? You know, you may get $1 million and you spend $1 million building it, and that's going to fail because you don't have the money to support it moving forward. And this thing has to evolve. It has to evolve over time. The other thing I've seen is a lot of ODR places where they've launched a core ODR program and it's failed because nobody used it. They had no marketing plan. So I love that you call this out, Danae. I love that we talk about how will it be marketed? How will you get awareness? Are you going to have incentives? Are you going to share success stories? The most effective form of marketing is testimonial marketing. If you say, hey, it's going to slice and dice and do your dishes for you, that's promise marketing. If somebody says, I went into this program and it solved my need and it was exactly what I wanted, that's 100 times more effective. So I love this section. Then tracking performance and preparing for the unexpected. And then I put in the ICODR standards here because I would like to think about how we can chunk some of this advice into the framework of the standards if we decide we want to include that. But Danae, give me an immediate reaction to this. It's a little bit different than the way you structured it in your presentation, but the content is very parallel. So tell me what you think.
Absolutely. This looks great. Obviously when we're looking at doing like a presentation or something like that, we're going to do a little bit more for entertainment purposes.
No,
right?
absolutely.
Something that's going to stick in your brain that you can retain it. When we talk about doing like a white paper or something like this, we do want it. We want it to be a little more structured. We want it to be a little more detailed, a little more granular. And certainly, being able to look at the high level and then get into the individual questions, the individual steps that you need to go through. This looks great. This looks great.
So,
I see some things in here that I maybe missed. I'm taking notes furiously.
For instance, I think there are places where we talk about evaluation over and over again because it's so important and it can go between different sections. But what I would love to do is first of all, I think it needs to be about a third as long. So that's hard because it's all valuable. And I think you're right. The more checklist it is, the better it fits with the ICODR needs. Your presentation is great because you have this whole narrative of the travel agent and what are the different steps and what's the travel insurance and how do you what's the itinerary for the trip. I think this is useless for a training because it's too dry. Your presentation is great because it takes people along that journey. But I would love to work collaboratively with you and some of the other folks on this call and other folks in ICODR as well, and even bring in Jan and some of the systems design expertise as well, because they may call out more philosophical questions and this is very practical on the ground advice. But this could turn into a really, really valuable document that ICODR could promote. We can translate into a bunch of different languages, send it all over the world, and this could actually help us ensure that ODR deployments are successful, which is crucial for the success of the field. So I think we don't have enough time to do this collaboratively together, but I see we have a lot of, let's see, we've got anonymous gopher, anonymous dinosaur, anonymous llama. So we have people in here, from the presentation who are looking at it. I would love it if people put in comments or thoughts or additions or questions, and then maybe we can jointly evolve this together. Obviously, Danae, we need to call you out. This is your work. So I think this is very important that you get credit for all of because this is just a repurposing of the content you've already generated. But what are your thoughts about all of this, Danae?
I love it. I love it. There's one thing that I heard you say that I think is incredibly valuable. I do want to I know I focused a lot on differentiating sort of ODR vendor from program plan, but we definitely need to have our ODR vendors involved in this, right? There's going to be some considerations that they need to consider functionality wise, especially when we're talking about best practices. We don't want to leave anybody behind us. I know that I also reached out to one of our configuration developers this week. I shared our ICODR presentation with him and said, can you just give this a listen while you're driving the kids to school or whatever? Yeah. Let me know if there's anything I missed. You have a completely different perspective. So yeah, bringing everybody in internationally, going back to what we just talked about with our stakeholders. Now we walk that talk. Who do we need to bring in? Who is impacted? Who's affected? Who's interested? And really have a conversation about it from all those different perspectives, because there may be things that we've missed. Certainly with looking at this document, if there's any updates or things that we've missed, then I would say maybe then we kind of look at how we're going to structure it. But obviously open to any sort of process there, but it looks great. Well, and I'm glad that you touched on that point because I forgot to highlight it.
Well, no, and I just want to say thank you to you because it was your presentation for ICODR that got the wheels turning here. And now this follow-on, which I think we've even added more to for Cyberweek, we now have this draft document and we have this recording and we're going to widen the circle and get more feedback on it. But Danae, I just want to thank you for putting the work into system type. First of all, the work you put into ensuring that all these ODR deployments are successful, but then distilling down all of your lessons learned and then letting us use that as the basis of the creation of this document. I think it's going to be really important for the field moving forward. So I want to thank you again for taking the time. So do you have any closing thoughts or comments?
Thank you for the venue.
Absolutely. No, you gotta, please. If I have a microphone, anything you want to say, I'll give it to you. You can talk through it. So a megaphone. Any other comments, questions, thoughts for Danae? I know we're at time, so we need to wrap this up.
Just real quick. Yay, amazing. The masterclass and this information just really welds together a lot of things for me as I'm starting to think about how to develop and deploy a system for the city of Seattle. I'm wondering if built in there, we could along the way get some clarity around doing an equity analysis and an accessibility analysis from, since, you know, a lot of the appeal in government sector has to do with access to justice, and ODR is a vehicle for that. And those would be two important components early on in the design.
I love that.
And
I'm putting that right in.
to consider.
So an equity and accessibility assessment. I love that.
Colin,
yeah, please, Jeff.
I would just add, in the access to justice space, the new technologies that are based on digital identity are critically important in this space, and the technology is being deployed, but there are very few people in the governance space who are working on the verifiable credentials that are necessary for the space itself to work. And that's an incredible place for, I've called the field cyber notaries myself, because it's really going to be a new field, but this is a field that could really move into that space.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I love that. Yeah, identity is, I know, Jeff, you've been working on that for so long. And I think that's, we talk about that in ODR. I think most ODR platforms, they just sort of follow on to identity best practices in terms of other web platforms. But we need to be creative, especially when we're talking about dealing with the populations that we're targeting. We need to think more expansively about identity.
Well, and you see it even in the smart contract space, where when they get to the venue, the choice of form clause, they punt and they put it right back into state court systems and other court systems. And you know yourself, they're not going to end up there. It's going to have to be a different path. But identity is the first step, because that's the party. And how you verify the trustworthiness of the declarations that are being made is a whole field for ODR to jump into.
Well, and also thinking about human-centered design. Our clients don't want a process, they want an outcome. And if you deliver them a process and then they have to go someplace else to get their outcome enforced, you didn't deliver the value that they wanted. You're going to frustrate them, even if it's the best process in the world. So it's an excellent point, Jeff. So, well, this is a work in progress, but Danae, thank you so much for taking the time today. And I think we moved the ball forward. There's a lot more work to do. But you set the snowball rolling at the top of the hill, and that's what we needed. So I want to respect everybody's time. Thank you so much for joining today, and stay tuned. We're going to have more ICODR meetings to talk specifically about this moving forward. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Everyone.